What if Robb Stark won? Robb Stark stood at the edge of the battlefield, the cold wind of the north biting through his armor like a warning from the gods. The war had changed everything. What once looked like a doomed rebellion had turned into something no one in Westeros expected: victory. Not small victories, not lucky escapes, but real, crushing wins that broke the strength of the Lannisters piece by piece. It had started with trust. Grey Wind had survived the attempt on his life at the Twins. That single difference changed everything. Robb never went to the Red Wedding. The Freys never got their chance. And once that betrayal failed, the North became something more dangerous than any Southern lord expected: united. Rage with a living king at its center. The Freys were punished first, not with haste, but with certainty. Robb Stark did not rush like a boy anymore. He moved like a king who had learned what betrayal cost. When the North marched on the Twins, it was not a chaotic attack. It was a message. The crossing fell, and with it, the illusion that the Riverlands could be controlled by fear and marriage alliances. From there, everything shifted. The Riverlords, once torn between oaths, bent the knee to Robb openly. Edmure Tully stood beside him, not as a hostage or bargaining piece, but as a loyal ally. The North and the Riverlands became a single blade aimed south. And when that blade struck the Lannister forces, it did not break like before it cut clean. King's Landing did not fall in a day. Nothing important ever did. But the war changed the moment Jaime Lannister was captured in the field, not through trickery, but through exhaustion. The Lannister army, stretched thin and overconfident, finally met an opponent who stopped reacting and started controlling the battlefield. Cersei Lannister tried to hold the capital together with pride and fear, but fear only works when victory still feels possible. When word spread that Robb Stark had taken Riverrun, that the Freys had fallen, and that the northern banners were moving south unchecked, even gold lost its power. Inside the Red Keep, the atmosphere turned sharp and poisonous. Lords began to question each other. Alliances built on gold started to crack. Even the Tyrells, watching carefully from Highgarden, began to reconsider which side looked like the future. Robb himself was no longer the boy who had marched south for his father. He had become something quieter, more focused. People expected rage from him, but what they got was control. Every decision was weighed, every battle calculated. His mother's lessons stayed with him, but so did the memory of betrayal. Catelyn Stark stood beside him often during council meetings, her presence both comfort and warning. She reminded him what revenge cost, what mercy could do, and what pride destroyed. But even she could see the change in him. The war had burned something away, leaving behind a colder kind of strength. The turning point came at the Trident. The Lannister forces tried one last push to break the northern advance before it reached the capital. It was supposed to be decisive. Instead, it became the moment everything collapsed for them. Robb lured them into ground he'd already studied for weeks. The battle was not loud. Chaos, it was structured destruction. Cavalry struck where they were weakest, archers controlled the retreat paths, and infantry held the center like an unbreakable wall. When it ended, the river ran shallow and red, and the Lannister banners were gone. That night, Robb did not celebrate. He stood alone near the water, staring at the reflection of a crown he did not yet wear. Victory did not feel like victory. It felt like responsibility becoming heavier, because now there was no excuse left. The victory at the Trident changed everything in a way that no song or celebration could fully capture. On the surface, it looked like the end of a war that had swallowed Westeros for years, but beneath that surface, something far more unstable had begun to form. Armies could be defeated, banners could be burned, and castles could be taken. But the idea of who should rule did not die so easily. In fact, it grew sharper after every battle Robb won. The more he succeeded, the more people started to fear what success would mean under a young king who had risen through war rather than inheritance. Lords who once dismissed him as a northern boy now watched him carefully, trying to understand whether he was still the same Robb Stark who had marched south for justice, or something entirely different shaped by victory itself. As the northern host moved closer to King's Landing, the capital itself began to feel the pressure long before any siege engines appeared at its gates. Inside the Red Keep, the atmosphere became unstable, almost sick with paranoia. Cersei Lannister clung to control with a desperation that bordered on madness, refusing to accept that the world she built around herself was collapsing. She ordered defenses strengthened, demanded loyalty from houses already looking for escape routes, and tried to maintain an image of power that no longer matched reality. Yet every message that arrived from the countryside told the same story. Lannister forces were retreating, supply lines were breaking, and bannermen were either surrendering or quietly switching allegiance to Robb Stark. Even those who hated the North more than the crown were beginning to calculate survival instead of loyalty. Tyrion Lannister, watching all of this unfold from within the capital, understood something his sister refused to admit. The war had stopped being about controlling territory and had become about controlling perception. Robb Stark was not just winning battles, he was winning belief. People started to believe that the North was not a rebellion, but an alternative future. That belief spread faster than any army could move, and it made every southern defense feel weaker than it actually was. Tyrion tried to advise caution, tried to push for negotiations, or at least a structured surrender that might preserve some stability, but his voice carried less weight with each passing day. Even his intelligence could not fix a system that was already breaking under its own fear. When Robb finally halted his forces outside the capital, he did not rush into an immediate assault. That decision alone confused many of his bannermen. Some expected him to strike quickly while the enemy was disorganized, but Robb had learned from every mistake that had ever cost him blood. He understood that taking a city was not just about breaking walls, it was about breaking will, and King's Landing was a city that survived on pride as much as stone. So instead of attacking, he tightened the noose slowly. He cut off supply routes, secured river crossings, and allowed word of his mercy towards surrendered houses to spread intentionally. He wanted the city to understand that resistance was no longer a heroic stand, but an unnecessary delay of the inevitable. Inside the capital, that strategy began to work. Fear and hope started to mix in dangerous ways. Some believed Robb Stark would bring order after years of Lannister control, while others believed he would punish the entire city for the sins of its rulers. Small riots broke out in different districts, not coordinated, but fueled by uncertainty. The Goldcloaks struggled to maintain control, but their loyalty was no longer unified. The city was beginning to fracture from within, not because of invasion, but because it no longer believed in its own leadership. During this time, Robb faced his own internal conflict more sharply than ever. Victory had not given him peace. Instead, it had given him choices that felt heavier than war itself. Every council meeting brought new arguments about what should happen after the city fell. Some northern lords demanded harsh punishment for the capital, believing that fear was the only language the South understood. Others, including voices from the Riverlands, urged restraint, warning that endless cycles of revenge would only create another war in the future. Captain Stark remained one of the strongest voices for caution, reminding Robb that ruling was not the same as conquering. But even she could see the pressure building around him, shaping him into a king who could not simply return to being a boy after victory. One evening, as the sun set over the distant walls of King's Landing, Robb walked alone along the edge of his encampment. The air carried the smell of distant smoke and sea salt, and for a moment everything felt strangely still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. He thought about his father, Ned Stark, and the kind of man he had been. Honor had defined Ned, but honor had also destroyed him in a city like this. Robb wondered if honor alone was enough to rule a world built on deception. He also wondered what his father would think of him now, standing at the edge of a conquered kingdom, not as a failed lord's son, but as the man who brought the war to its final threshold. That night, a messenger arrived from inside the city under a flag of truce. The message was simple but heavy. The crown was willing to negotiate surrender, but only if Robb Stark agreed to terms that would preserve the Lannister line and guarantee certain houses protection. It was not an offer of peace in the traditional sense. It was an attempt to shape the outcome, even in defeat. Robb read the message several times before speaking, understanding that this moment would define everything that came after the war. If he accepted too many compromises, the victory would feel hollow. If he refused entirely, the city might turn into a slaughter that would haunt the North for generations. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he folded the parchment and looked toward the dark silhouette of the capital in the distance. The war had reached its final stage, But the hardest battle was no longer outside the walls. It was inside his decisions, and whatever he chose next would decide not just who ruled Westeros, but what kind of king Robb Stark would become in a world that had already seen too much blood to believe in simple endings. The silence before Robb Stark made his decision felt heavier than any battlefield he had ever stood on. It was strange how war, with all its noise and chaos, could feel simpler than peace. On the field, you knew your enemy, you saw their banners, you understood the moment of attack and retreat. But here, standing between surrender and conquest, everything was uncertain. Nothing told him what was right anymore. Even the men around him, the ones who had followed him through snow and blood and betrayal, no longer spoke with one voice. They watched him now not as a young lord they were protecting, but as a king whose next choice would decide whether they would return home as heroes or become the rulers of ashes. Inside King's Landing, the tension only grew sharper as the days passed without an answer. Cersei Lannister refused to accept that silence itself was becoming a form of judgment. She paced the Red Keep like a caged animal, alternating between fury and disbelief, clinging to the belief that some final twist would save her rule. Yet even she could feel it slipping away. The nobles who once bowed quickly now hesitated before speaking. Servants moved with lowered eyes, avoiding contact, as if loyalty itself had become dangerous. The city outside the castle walls was no longer fully under control either. Markets functioned, but cautiously. Guards still stood at their posts, but their authority felt thin, like paper stretched over something already tearing underneath. Tyrion Lannister, watching everything from within the collapsing structure of his family's power, understood that the real defeat had already happened mentally long before it would happen physically. He had seen enough politics to know when a ruler had lost the confidence of the ruled. Robb Stark had not just defeated armies, he had changed the expectation of what came next. People were no longer asking if the North would win, but how it would rule. That shift was dangerous because it meant the crown had already lost its narrative. Tyrion tried one last time to convince Cersei that negotiation, even humiliation, was better than destruction, but pride had become her armor and her prison. She could not imagine a world where she was not in control, even if that world was already standing outside her gates. On the northern side of the city, Robb finally called a council that lasted far longer than any battle strategy meeting he had ever held. The tent was filled with voices that pulled in different directions, each shaped by the cost they had paid in war. The Northern Lords wanted finality, a decisive end that would erase the possibility of future betrayal. The River Lords, especially those who had suffered under Lannister occupation, demanded justice but not chaos, arguing that if the North became as cruel as its enemies, then nothing meaningful had been won. Catelyn Stark sat close to Robb, watching him more than the others, because she understood that this decision would not just shape the realm, it would shape him. She reminded him again that Ned Stark had chosen honor even when it cost him everything, but she also did not push him blindly into repeating the same path. She knew the world was not the same as it had been when her husband bent his knee to what he believed was justice. Robb listened to them all. But what weighed on him most was not their arguments. It was the memory of everything that had led him here. The faces of those who died in earlier battles, the betrayal at the twins that never came in this version of history, the men who believed in him not because he was the strongest, but because he represented something different from the cruelty of Southern politics. You wondered when that image began to shift. At what point did he stop being the boy who fought for his father and become something closer to the thing he once fought against? A ruler who had to decide the fate of thousands with a single choice. When the final answer came, it was not shouted or dramatic. Robb Stark simply stood, and the room fell silent in the way it always did when he made a decision that could not be argued against. He declared that King's Landing would not be destroyed. There would be no sack, no burning of the city, no revenge taken on civilians who had already suffered under years of unstable rule. But he also declared that House Lannister's direct claim to the throne was finished. There would be surrender, but it would be unconditional in terms of power, not destruction. Those responsible for war decisions would be judged, but the city itself would live. The reaction was immediate but divided. Some lords saw it as weakness, others as wisdom. Catelyn said nothing at first, only studied him carefully, as if measuring how much of Ned Stark still remained in him and how much had changed. Robb himself did not look relieved. If anything, the decision seemed to settle like weight in his chest. Mercy, he realized, was not lighter than cruelty. It simply created a different kind of responsibility. The surrender of King's Landing came within days. There was no final grand battle. Instead, the gates opened slowly under guarded terms, and Robb Stark's forces entered the city not as conquerors in flame and fury, but as controlled occupiers of a capital that had already surrendered internally, long before its walls gave in. The Lannister banners were taken down with a strange mix of anger and exhaustion from the remaining loyalists. Cersei was taken into custody, her rage still burning even as her power was stripped away. Jaime Lannister, still a prisoner of war, watched the transition with a silence that carried more meaning than words. As Robb entered the Red Keep for the first time as the undisputed victor of the war, he did not feel triumph. The halls that once symbolized Lannister dominance now felt hollow, as if power itself had drained out of the stone. The Iron Throne Room was quieter than he expected. The great chair of swords stood unchanged. Yet somehow it no longer felt like the center of the world. It felt like an artifact from a past that had finally ended. Robb stood there for a long time, not moving toward it immediately. He understood that sitting on it would be the final act that transformed him from a war leader into something permanent. And permanence, he realized, was far more dangerous than victory, because war eventually ends, but rule does not. And whatever he chose to build next would either justify everything that had been lost, or prove that even victory could become another form of ruin. The days after King's Landing fell into Robb Stark's control were not marked by celebration, but by a strange, uneasy quiet that no one quite knew how to handle. The city had expected fire or punishment or chaos, something to match the years of fear it had lived under, yet what it received instead was structure. Northern banners stood at the gates, Riverland commanders were placed into key positions, and strict rules were enforced on the Gold Cloaks, but there was no mass slaughter, no burning streets, no uncontrolled revenge. That absence of brutality confused many people more than violence ever could. It made rumors spread faster than truth, because the mind of a city that has survived tyranny always prepares for the next one. Even when it is told, mercy has arrived. Inside the Red Keep, Robb began the slow and exhausting work of turning conquest into governance. It was far more difficult than anything he had done on the battlefield. War had been about movement, reaction, and instinct. Rule was about patience, compromise, and accepting that every decision created consequences that would outlive him. Lords from different regions were brought before him one by one, each carrying their own fears and expectations. Some bowed quickly, hoping to secure their positions under the new order. Others resisted silently, their loyalty still tangled in old alliances that no longer had a throne to serve. Robb listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, his words carried a weight that made even hostile men reconsider open defiance. Catelyn Stark remained close during these early days of rule, but her presence was no longer only that of a mother or advisor. She had become something like a bridge between Robb and the southern political world, reminding him constantly that victory in war did not erase centuries of tradition overnight. She urged caution with punishment, careful integration of former enemies, and the importance of stability over satisfaction. Robb heard her, but he also felt the tension growing between what was practical and what was just. The war had taught him that mercy could prevent endless cycles of revenge. But it had also shown him how dangerous unchecked ambition could become. Every decision felt like walking a line between becoming the ruler the realm needed and becoming the kind of ruler it feared. One of the most difficult issues was what to do with the remaining Lannisters. Cersei's influence had been effectively broken, but she remained a symbol, and symbols were more dangerous than armies. Some of Robb's advisors demanded execution, arguing that leaving her alive would allow her supporters to rally around her again. Others warned that killing her would turn her into a martyr in the eyes of those still loyal to House Lannister. Robb found himself trapped between strategic necessity and moral consequence, unable to fully commit to either path without creating future instability. In the end, he ordered her imprisonment under strict conditions, not out of mercy alone, but out of recognition that her death might solve nothing and risk everything. Tyrion Lannister, who had expected either execution or exile, was instead placed under guarded observation within the city. Robb surprised many by choosing to speak with him directly. Their conversations were not friendly, but they were honest in a way few political exchanges ever were. Tyrion did not hide his understanding of how fragile power truly was, and Robb did not pretend he had all the answers. In Tyrion, Robb saw a mind shaped by survival in a cruel court, but also one capable of understanding the deeper mechanics of governance. It was a cautious exchange, but it planted the early seeds of something neither of them fully trusted, yet a reluctant respect built on necessity rather than alliance. Outside the capital, the rest of Westeros was adjusting to the new reality with varying levels of acceptance and resistance. The Riverlands, having suffered most during the war, largely supported Robb's rule, seeing him as both liberator and protector. The North remained loyal out of tradition and belief in his leadership. But even there, questions quietly emerged about what kind of king Robb Stark would become now that war no longer defined him. The Reach and the Stormlands watched closely, waiting to see whether this new order would hold or fracture under pressure. Even Dawn sent quiet envoys, not committing, but observing, always observing. Within the city itself, daily life slowly resumed, though it never returned to what it had been before. Markets reopened, trade resumed cautiously, and people began to speak in lower voices about politics, no longer sure which words might bring consequences. Robb's guards enforced order without excess cruelty, but their presence was constant, a reminder that peace had been enforced, not simply achieved. This balance between safety and tension defined the early days of his rule more than anything else. It was not peace in the way songs described it, but it was not war either. It was something in between, fragile and still forming. As Robb spent more time within the Red Keep, he began to notice how the throne itself affected everyone who came near it. Lords who entered the chamber changed their posture without realizing it. Voices lowered, confidence shifted, and even the bravest men seemed to become aware of their own mortality in the presence of that iron structure. Robb himself felt it too, though he resisted acknowledging it openly. The throne did not feel like a reward. It felt like a judgment, waiting to be passed. Every time he looked at it, he was reminded that countless wars had been fought for it, and none of those wars had ended without cost. One evening, after a long council session filled with arguments over taxation, border control, and remaining Lannister assets, Robb finally walked alone into the throne room. There were no guards close enough to interrupt him, only distant footsteps echoing in stone corridors. He stood before the Iron Throne for a long time, studying it, not as a symbol of victory, but as a question. Everything he had done had led to this moment, yet nothing about this moment felt complete. The war was over, but the consequences were only beginning. He reached out and touched the cold metal, feeling its uneven edges press against his hand. It was uncomfortable, almost intentionally so, as if the throne itself rejected ease. In that moment, Robb understood something that no battle had taught him. Winning the war had been the easy part compared to surviving the peace that followed, because peace required him to become something more permanent than a commander. It required him to become the foundation of a world that would either remember him as the king who ended an age of chaos, or the king who simply replaced one kind of suffering with another. The Iron Throne room felt different. After Robb Stark made that silent moment his own. Nothing physically changed, but something in the air had shifted. What the room had finally accepted that a new kind of authority now stood where old cruelty once ruled. Robb did not sit immediately. Instead, he began to understand that the throne was not just a seat of power, but a constant test. Every ruler who came here would either bend the realm to their will or be slowly shaped by it until they no longer recognized themselves. That realization stayed with him as he left the chamber more than any victory ever had, because now there was no battlefield to blame, no enemy to focus on, only the slow, unending responsibility of holding together a fractured world. The early months of Robb's rule were defined by construction more than conquest. Roads that had been broken during the war were repaired first, not because they were glamorous, but because they were necessary. Supply lines had to be restored, grain shipments stabilized, and trade between the North and South carefully reopened. He understood that people did not judge kings by speeches or titles, but by whether they could eat, travel, and live without fear. So while some lords demanded grander political gestures, Robb focused on what kept the realm functioning. It was not the kind of leadership songs were made about, but it was the kind that prevented collapse. Still, not everyone accepted this new order easily. In the shadows of the capital and beyond, remnants of Lannister loyalty began to shift from open war to quiet resistance. It was no longer armies on battlefields, but whispers in taverns, hidden meetings in noble houses, and small acts of sabotage meant to test the strength of Robb's control. These were not large enough to threaten his rule directly, but they were enough to create constant pressure. Every report of unrest forced him to react, to adjust, to tighten or loosen control depending on the region. He quickly learned that ruling a kingdom was not about winning once, but about winning repeatedly in different forms every single day. Catelyn Stark watched this transformation in her son with a mixture of pride and concern. She had seen kings before. She had negotiated with them, feared them, and buried the consequences of their decisions. What she saw in Robb was not tyranny, but something more dangerous in its own way. Responsibility that was beginning to isolate him. He still listened, still asked for counsel, but there were moments when she could see that the final weight of decisions no longer rested on shared discussion. It rested on him alone. That is what kingship did, she realized. Not just elevate a man, but slowly separate him from everyone who once treated him as human first and ruler second. Tyrion Lannister remained one of the most complicated pieces in this new order. His presence in King's Landing under guarded status created constant tension among both northern commanders and southern survivors. Some saw him as a threat, waiting to ignite rebellion. Others saw him as a valuable mind that could help stabilize the fragile governance system. Robb himself continued to speak with him occasionally, and over time their conversations shifted from cautious analysis to deeper discussions about how kingdoms truly failed. Tyrion did not flatter Robb, nor did he pretend that peace would last easily. He spoke openly about corruption, fear, and the way power always attracted those willing to exploit it. Robb, in return, spoke less about ideals and more about survival. Between them, an uncomfortable understanding formed. Neither of them trusted the system they were building, but both knew it was what remained after war destroyed everything else. Far from the capital, the North itself began to change in subtle ways. With Robb no longer constantly on campaign, governance there had to revolve beyond wartime structure. Bannermen returned to their lands, disputes over resources and old grudges resurfaced, and local leadership became more important than ever. The North had always been proud of its independence, but now it had to adjust to being part of a larger political reality that extended beyond winter traditions and old customs. Some lords resisted this integration quietly, not through rebellion, but through delay and non-compliance. Robb had to learn that loyalty was not a permanent state. It had to be maintained, reinforced, and sometimes negotiated continuously. As seasons changed, the emotional weight of leadership began to settle deeper into Robb's life. He still remembered the simplicity of war, when every problem had an enemy and every solution involved movement. Now, problems had layers. Every decision had political, economic, and personal consequences. Even justice itself became complicated. Trials were held for those accused of war crimes, but determining truth was never simple. Witnesses contradicted each other. Alliances influenced testimonies, and memory itself became a battlefield of interpretation. Robb found himself constantly asking whether he was delivering justice or simply reorganizing power under a different name. One night, after a particularly long council meeting that ended with no satisfying resolution to a border dispute between Riverland and Crownland interests, Robb walked alone through the quiet corridors of the Red Keep. The city outside was calm, but not peaceful in the absolute sense. It was the calm of exhaustion after years of instability, not the calm of true safety. As he moved through the stone halls, he passed tapestries and statues that once celebrated Lannister victories, now quietly being replaced or removed. Each change was small, but together they marked the slow rewriting of history in real time. He eventually found himself again at the entrance to the throne room. This time, he did not hesitate to enter. The Iron Throne still dominated the space, but it no longer felt like an object of fear alone. It felt like a mirror, reflecting back not power itself, but the burden of maintaining it. Robb stepped forward slowly, not with hesitation, but with awareness. When he finally sat down, it was not a moment of triumph. It was acceptance. Sitting there, Robb Stark understood something that war had never fully revealed to him. Winning a throne did not end conflict. It changed its shape, Enemies no longer wore armor or carried swords. They appeared as shortages, rebellions, political demands, and moral compromises. Every decision would now create a ripple that extended far beyond what he could see, and yet stepping away from it was not an option anymore. The realm had been changed by blood and victory, and now it would be shaped by whatever kind of king he chose to become within that seat of iron and expectation. Sitting on the Iron Throne did not bring Robb Stark the sense of arrival he once imagined it might. Instead, it brought a quiet clarity that felt almost unsettling in its simplicity. From that height, the throne room no longer looked like a place of triumph, but like the center of a machine that never truly stopped working. Every sound echoed differently. There, the footsteps of guards, the distant opening of doors, even the faint rustle of banners outside the chamber felt like reminders that the world beyond this room was constantly moving, constantly moving. Robb realized that ruling was not a moment one reached, but a condition one remained inside without escape. In the weeks that followed, governance became less about reacting to crises and more about anticipating them. Reports arrived daily from every corner of the realm, each one carrying its own urgency. A dispute between river lords over reclaimed land, tension in the reach over grain distribution, unrest in former Lannister territories where families struggled to accept new authority. None of these issues were large enough to be called war, but together they formed something more exhausting than war, a constant need to stabilize everything at once. Robb found himself reading documents late into the night, not because he enjoyed it, but because delaying decisions only allowed problems to grow in ways that became harder to control later. The North itself began to feel the strain of this new order in subtle but noticeable ways. Long-distance governance meant that local leaders had more autonomy than ever before, and with autonomy came interpretation. Some lords enforced Robb's laws with loyalty and precision, while others adapted them to suit their own interests. Messages were sent back and forth across great distances, but by the time responses returned, situations had often already changed. It was the first time Robb fully understood that ruling a vast territory was not about direct control, but about trust in people who might not always share the same urgency as the crown. Catelyn Stark continued to be one of his most trusted voices, but even her advice began to take on a heavier tone. She saw how the pressure was shaping him, not breaking him, but slowly hardening him in ways that made him harder to reach emotionally. He still listened, still considered counsel carefully, but there was a growing distance between decision and feeling. Where once he might have reacted with immediate emotion, now there was calculation first, reflection later. Catelyn understood why this change was happening, but that did not make it easier to watch. She had seen enough rulers in her life to know that the line between strength and isolation was thin, and once crossed, it was rarely returned. Tyrion Lannister's presence remained a constant complication within the political structure of King's Landing. Though officially under watch, his influence in discussions grew quietly, because of his understanding of how the capital functioned beneath its surface. He pointed out inefficiencies in supply chains, weaknesses in tax collection systems, and vulnerabilities in regional loyalties that others overlooked. Some Northern lords disliked his involvement deeply, viewing it as dangerous to rely on the Lannister mind, even a subdued one. But Robb saw something more practical in it. Tyrion did not pretend the system was noble. He understood it was fragile, and that honesty made his advice valuable in ways blind loyalty never could be. Still, not all challenges were administrative. There were moments when Robb felt the weight of legitimacy pressing harder than any rebellion or economic issue. The realm had accepted his victory, but acceptance was not the same as devotion. Many southern houses still viewed him as a conqueror rather than a rightful ruler, and while they obeyed his commands, they did so with caution, waiting to see if his rule would strengthen or collapse. Every act of governance was therefore also an act of communication. Mercy was not just kindness, it was a message. Punishment was not just justice, it was a warning. Every decision carried meaning beyond its immediate effect. One of the most difficult decisions came when unrest in a former Lannister stronghold escalated into open resistance. It was not a large uprising, but it was symbolic, a refusal to accept northern authority in a region that had suffered heavily during the war. The council debated harsh responses, some arguing for decisive suppression to prevent similar incidents elsewhere. Others warned that excessive force would only create long-term resentment. Robb listened as always, But what he struggled with was not strategy. It was proportion. How much pressure was enough to maintain order without turning governance into oppression? In the end, he chose a measured response: targeted arrests of ringleaders, redistribution of local governance to neutral houses, and public acknowledgement of grievances that had fueled the unrest. It was not a perfect solution, and it satisfied no one completely, but it restored stability without escalating violence. That outcome, Robb realized, was becoming the true measure of his rule, not perfection, but controlled imperfection that prevented collapse. As months passed, the rhythm of rule slowly replaced the rhythm of war. Meetings, reports, negotiations, and judgments became the structure of his days. There were still moments of tension, still occasional threats, but they no longer defined everything. Instead, they became interruptions within a larger system that was slowly stabilizing under his direction. Yet even as external pressure eased slightly, internal reflection deepened. Robb began to notice how often he was alone, not physically, but mentally. Even in crowded council chambers, even while speaking with trusted advisors, there were thoughts he could not fully share because they belonged only to the burden of decision. One evening, after a long day of political negotiations with representatives from the Reach, Robb returned to the throne room alone. The city outside was quiet, the sky darkening into the deep colors of late evening. He stood before the Iron Throne for a long time without moving, not because he was uncertain, but because he was uncertain, but because he was aware. Aware that nothing about this position allowed for rest in the way he once understood it. Then, slowly, he sat again. This time, there was no hesitation at all, but there was also no illusion of arrival. Sitting there, Robb Stark understood more fully than ever that the war had never truly ended. It had only transformed. The battlefield was now governance. The enemies were instability and doubt, and the victories were temporary balances that required constant maintenance. Yet within that understanding was also something quieter, something almost grounding. If this was the shape of his life now, then it meant there was still a future to build. Still a realm that could either hold together or fall apart depending on how carefully it was guided. And so he remained there, not as a boy who once marched south for justice, and not even only as a conqueror who had taken a throne, but as something in between, someone learning slowly and painfully. That ruling a broken world was not about ending its chaos, but about learning how to live inside it without letting it collapse completely. The longer Robb Stark remained on the Iron Throne, the more he began to understand that power was not something you held, it was something you constantly negotiated with. Every day brought new friction points where stability could either hold or slip, and the difference often came down to decisions that seemed small on the surface but carried long shadows underneath. A change in tax policy here, a delayed judgment there, a refusal to punish one noble house too harshly or too softly somewhere else. Nothing was isolated anymore. Everything connected, and every connection carried consequences that rippled outward in ways no single council meeting could fully predict. The capital itself continued to adjust to its new reality. King's Landing had always been a city of shifting loyalties, but under Robb's rule, that shifting became more visible, almost more honest. People no longer pretended certainty about where power would settle long-term. Instead, they adapted day by day, measuring safety not by banners alone, but by the behavior of those who enforced them. Northern soldiers patrolled the same streets where Lannister guards once stood, and although their discipline was strict, it lacked the cruelty that had once defined the city's fear. That absence slowly changed the atmosphere, not into trust, not yet, but into something more cautious and observant. Within the Red Keep, Robb's council had also begun to evolve. What was once a gathering of war leaders slowly transformed into something closer to a governing body. Riverlords, northern bannermen, and carefully selected southern advisors all shared the same space, though not always the same assumptions. Discussions became longer, more detailed, and often more difficult to resolve. The simplicity of wartime command, where urgency forced clarity, had been replaced by the complexity of governance, where patience often mattered more than speed. Robb found himself less like a commander issuing orders and more like a stabilizing center point between competing interpretations of what the realm should become. Catelyn Stark continued to serve as one of his most consistent guiding presences, but even her role had subtly shifted. She was no longer just advising a son she worried about. She was advising a king whose decisions affected thousands beyond their family. That change weighed on her more than she admitted. She could see how each compromise Robb made, even the necessary ones, chipped away at the simplicity of the moral world she once tried to protect him from. Yet she also recognized that without those compromises, there would be no stability at all. The world they had entered did not reward purity. It rewarded endurance. Tyrion Lannister, still held under watch but increasingly consulted in matters of structure and policy, became a strange but undeniable part of this new order. His perspective on governance was not rooted in loyalty, but in observation. He understood how fear moved through systems, how corruption disguised itself as tradition, and how fragile legitimacy could be when it depended too heavily on perception rather than function. Some of Robb's advisors distrusted him deeply, unable to separate his intellect from his surname. But Robb had begun to recognize a hard truth. Survival of the realm required using every available mind, even those shaped by the very system they had defeated. Over time, small reforms began to take shape. Trade routes were stabilized between the north and southern kingdoms, reducing the economic fragmentation that had worsened during the war. Local governance structures were adjusted to reduce the concentration of power in single noble houses, especially in regions that had previously been flashpoints of rebellion. Justice systems were standardized in key areas to reduce arbitrary rulings by local lords. None of these changes were revolutionary on their own, but together they slowly shifted the foundation of how the realm functioned. It was not the dramatic reshaping of Westeros that songs might one day claim, but something quieter and arguably more lasting, a gradual reorganization of how power actually worked. It even as governance improved on the surface, beneath it remained tension that could not be fully erased. Former Lannister loyalists still existed within the system, not always openly hostile, but not fully integrated either. They obeyed orders but questioned intentions. They complied with law but withheld trust. Robb understood that this was not something that could be solved quickly. It would take time, perhaps generations, for loyalty to shift from fear of punishment to belief in stability. That realization did not discourage him, but it did remove any illusion that victory had completed anything. One night, after a particularly exhausting council session that ended with unresolved disagreements about border enforcement in the Riverlands, Robb remained in the throne room long after everyone else had left. The candles burned low, casting long shadows across the iron spikes of the throne. The silence was not empty. It was full of all the conversations that had not been fully resolved. He stood at the base of the steps for a long time before finally ascending and sitting down again, not out of ceremony but out of necessity. The weight of leadership did not lessen with familiarity. If anything, it became more defined, more constant. As he sat there, Robb thought about how different the everything might have gone if any single decision earlier in the war had changed. If alliances had failed, if battles had been lost, if betrayal had occurred, as it once had in another possible version of history. But that line of thought no longer served him. The present was not shaped by what-ifs, but by what remained. And what remained was a fractured kingdom slowly learning to function under a new center of power that was still itself learning how to exist. Outside the Red Keep, King's Landing continued to breathe as a city that had survived too many rulers to fully trust any of them. Life returned in uneven rhythms. Some districts recovered quickly, thriving under restored trade and reduced violence. Others remained cautious, slower to open, carrying memories of instability that did not disappear simply because banners had changed. The city was not healed, but it was no longer breaking. That difference mattered more than it appeared on the surface. Robb understood more clearly now than ever that his victory had not created an ending. It had created a responsibility without a clear finish line. There would be no final moment where everything was complete, no point at which he could declare the work done and step away. Instead, there would only be continuation adjustments, corrections, responses, and the constant pressure of maintaining balance in a world that naturally drifted toward instability. And so he remained on the throne not as a conqueror who had finished a war, but as a ruler who had entered something far more enduring. Not a story of victory, but a story of maintenance. Not a moment of glory, but a long, unbroken commitment to preventing collapse in a kingdom that would always be one decision away from falling apart again. As the years of Robb Stark's rule slowly began to stretch beyond the immediate shock of conquest, Westeros started to settle into a new kind of stability that no one fully trusted, but everyone quietly depended on. It was not the kind of peace that came from unity or shared belief, but the kind that emerged when exhaustion outweighed resistance. The wars had drained the great houses, the small folk, and even the land itself. Fields that once fed armies now struggled to recover, and trade routes that once carried wealth now carried only cautious hope. In this environment, Robb's rule became less about enforcing dominance and more about maintaining balance in a realm that no longer had the strength to break apart again. King's Landing, once the center of constant fear and shifting power, had transformed into something quieter but far more complex. The city no longer lived in anticipation of sudden regime change, but it also did not fully trust permanence. People adapted in layers. Merchants focused on rebuilding their businesses, craftsmen reopened workshops, and the poorer districts slowly regained a sense of routine. But underneath all of it was an awareness that stability could still be temporary. Northern guards patrolled the streets with discipline, but without the cruelty that had once defined authority in the capital. And over time, this began to reshape public behavior. Crime did not disappear, but it became more calculated, less chaotic, as if even lawlessness had learned to operate within new boundaries. Within the Red Keep, Robb's presence as king had become familiar, yet never fully ordinary. The Iron Throne no longer felt like an alien object to him, but it never became comfortable either. Every time he sat upon it, he was reminded that leadership was not a position that allowed ease. It demanded constant awareness of everything happening beyond the walls of the throne room. Letters arrived daily, each one carrying fragments of the realm's condition. Some were requests for assistance, others were disputes requiring judgment, and some were subtle warnings disguised as polite correspondence. Over time, Robb learned to read not only the words but the intentions behind them, understanding that politics often spoke more clearly in hesitation than in direct statements. Catelyn Stark, though still close to him, had begun to take on a quieter role in his life. She was no longer constantly at his side in every council meeting, but her influence remained deeply embedded in his decision-making process. She represented something Robb could not fully step away from, the emotional memory of what the war had cost and what it had been fought for. Yet even she had begun to recognize that her son no longer saw the world in the same sharp, moral lines that once defined him. He had not abandoned his values, but he had learned to apply them in a world where every choice carried unavoidable compromise. That shift troubled her at times, but it also reassured her in quieter moments, because it meant he had not become blind to reality. Tyrion Lannister's position in this new order continued to evolve in unexpected ways. Though still formally under watch, his role gradually shifted from prisoner to advisor in all but name. His understanding of administrative systems, taxation, and political psychology became increasingly valuable as Robb's administration expanded beyond simple post-war stabilization. Tyrion did not pretend loyalty, but he also did not actively undermine the structure that kept the realm from slipping back into chaos. Instead, he operated in a space of intellectual honesty, pointing out weaknesses without offering illusions. This made him both useful and deeply controversial, as many in Robb's court could not reconcile his insight with his family name. Beyond the capital, the rest of the realm continued its slow adaptation. The North remained loyal, though not without its own evolving expectations. Now that their king ruled from the south, questions arose about how northern identity would be preserved within a broader, unified kingdom. The Riverlands, which had suffered heavily during the war, remained one of Robb's strongest sources of support, but even there, rebuilding was slow and often uneven. The Reach and Stormlands operated more cautiously, aligning themselves with the new regime only as far as it served their interests. Dorne remained distant, observing rather than engaging, as it had always done. Westeros was no longer divided by open war, but by degrees of trust that shifted constantly depending on circumstance. One of the more difficult challenges Robb faced during this period was the question of justice. With the war officially over, demands for accountability became more frequent. Families sought closure for wartime losses, former soldiers sought recognition or compensation, and regional lords demanded clarity on how far past crimes would be judged under the new regime. Robb quickly discovered that justice in peace was far more complicated than justice in war. During war, enemies were clear. In peace, They were often neighbors, allies, or even members of the same administration. Every decision to punish or forgive carried political consequences that extended far beyond the original act. Over time, Robb developed a more structured approach to governance, relying heavily on councils and regional representatives rather than centralized decree. This reduced the burden on the throne but increased the complexity of coordination. Information moved more slowly. Decisions took longer to finalize and disagreements became more common. Yet despite these challenges, the system held, not because it was perfect, but because it was flexible enough to absorb imperfection without collapsing. As seasons changed and years continued to pass, Robb found himself reflecting less on victory and more on sustainability. The memory of war did not fade, but it no longer defined every moment of his rule. Instead, it became a reference point, a reminder of what instability looked like when left unchecked. He began to understand that the true measure of leadership was not how decisively one could win a war, but how carefully one could prevent the need for another. That understanding did not bring comfort, but it brought clarity. One evening, long after most of the court had retired for the night, Robb stood alone, once again, in the throne room. The city beyond the walls was quiet, not asleep, but settled into the rhythm of long-term living rather than crisis survival. He looked at the Iron Throne not as a prize or threat, but as a structure that required constant attention simply to remain meaningful. Then he sat down without ceremony or hesitation. There was no moment of revelation, no dramatic shift in feeling, only the steady awareness that this was now his place, not as an ending to a story, but as the ongoing center of one that would continue long after any single victory could define it. Years passed, and Westeros slowly stopped behaving like a realm recovering from war, and started behaving like a realm trying to live with a new kind of order. Robb Stark's rule had matured into something that could no longer be described in simple terms like victory or conquest. It had become structure, routine, expectation. The early tension of his reign, fear of rebellion, fear of collapse, fear of rejection, did not disappear completely, but it softened into background pressure rather than constant crisis. The great houses learned to operate within his system, not because they fully trusted it, but because it proved more stable than anything that had existed before it. Stability, even imperfect stability, eventually becomes its own form of authority. King's Landing itself changed in ways that were not dramatic, but deeply visible to those who remembered what it had once been. The streets were still crowded, still loud, still chaotic in the way large cities always were, but the unpredictability had reduced. The small folk no longer lived under the immediate expectation of sudden purges or violent shifts in power. Markets functioned with a sense of continuity that had been missing for years. Guards still enforced order, but the fear they once represented had faded into something closer to disciplined presence. The city did not become gentle, but it became predictable. And in a place like King's Landing, predictability was its own kind of peace. Inside the Red Keep, Robb Stark had become less of an outsider and more of an anchor. He was no longer viewed as the boy who conquered the South, or even the Northern king who overturned an empire. He was simply the king who remained, the one whose decisions shaped the flow of governance, without being constantly questioned at the edge of collapse. The Iron Throne, which once felt like a weight pressing against his identity, had become something he could sit upon without being consumed by its symbolism. That did not mean it lost its danger, only that he had learned to recognize it without being controlled by it. His council had evolved into a functioning political structure rather than a wartime advisory group. The Northern Lords, who once followed him out of loyalty and battlefield unity, had settled into administrative roles. Riverland representatives managed regional disputes. Select Southern houses participated in governance, not as conquered subjects, but as negotiated partners. Even Tyrion Lannister, still a controversial presence, had become a deeply embedded part of the system. His counsel on economics, infrastructure, and internal stability was often correct in ways others were reluctant to admit. Over time, opposition to his involvement did not disappear, but it became less emotionally charged and more procedural, debated in terms of usefulness rather than identity. Catelyn Stark aged into her role within this new world with a kind of quiet resilience. She was no longer constantly at the center of political decision-making, but she remained one of Robb's most trusted voices, especially when matters touched on legitimacy, tradition, and moral consequence. She had watched her son transform from a boy driven by duty into a man shaped by governance, and while she sometimes grieved the simplicity of what had been lost, she also understood that the world they now lived in required exactly what he had become. Her advice softened over time, not in strength, but in acceptance of complexity. Beyond the capital, the realm continued to adjust itself around the reality of unified rule. The North maintained its identity, but it was no longer isolated in its thinking. Trade, communication, and governance tied it more closely to the rest of the kingdoms than ever before. The Riverlands rebuilt slowly, still carrying scars from years of being a battlefield, but also becoming one of the more stable regions under Robb's system. The Reach, always pragmatic, deepened its economic influence under the new order. The Stormlands and Dawn remained more distant in political integration, but even they acknowledged the shift in balance that had taken place across Westeros. What defined Robb's later reign most was not expansion or conquest, but maintenance of equilibrium. He rarely faced existential threats anymore, but he constantly managed smaller instabilities that could, if ignored, accumulate into larger ones. Disputes between houses, economic imbalances, localized unrest, and political maneuvering replaced battlefield strategy as the primary concerns of the crown. He had learned that kingdoms did not fall in dramatic moments most of the time. They eroded slowly when unattended, and his role was to prevent that erosion from becoming irreversible. There were still moments, however, when the weight of it all became visible even to those closest to him. On nights when the city was quiet and the council halls were empty, Robb would sometimes remain in the throne room longer than necessary, not out of ceremony, but out of thought. The Iron Throne never changed, but his perception of it did. It no longer represented a goal achieved or a prize won. It represented continuity, obligation, and the endless responsibility of holding together something that would always be slightly unstable, no matter how carefully it was managed. One such night came many years into his reign, when most of the realm had settled into an uneasy but functioning peace. The city outside was calm in the way cities become, when they are no longer in crisis, but not entirely free of tension. Robb entered the throne room alone, as he often did, when decisions lingered in his mind longer than council meetings allowed. He stood before the Iron Throne for a long time without moving, not because he was uncertain, but because he was aware of how far he had come from the boy who once saw it as an ending. When he finally stepped forward and sat, there was no transformation, no sudden realization, no symbolic completion of a journey. There was only acceptance of continuity. The throne did not change him anymore, because he had already been shaped long ago by everything it represented. What remained was not the story of a boy becoming king, but the quieter, longer story of a king maintaining a world that would never fully stabilize, no matter who sat in that seat. And so Robb Stark remained there, not as a figure of final victory, but as a constant presence in a realm that had learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to survive its own history.